Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in just a few moments since we only have 30 minutes today. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. All right, well, let's get right into it. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar, Scope 3 Instruments, Navigating Market-Based Solutions. This is the first session in our SBTi Net Zero consultation series, and we will break down what businesses need to know about the new updates and the consultation ongoing. Thank you very much for being here. Today, we'll explore key updates from the Science Based Targets initiatives and what they mean for corporate climate strategies moving forward. Let's start with a bit of background. Well, of course, the SBTi has launched a consultation on its updated corporate net zero standard, introducing key changes that will basically shape how companies tackle their climate impact and strategies. This first webinar is the first edition of a three-part series where we'll explore critical topics. So the first one, Scope 3 instruments, which is what we are going to cover today. Second one will be around beyond value chain mitigation and neutralization. That will happen early May. And then the last one around climate transition plans at the end of May. So today we are kicking things off with a deep dive into Scope 3, decarbonisation. As companies and businesses work to reduce emissions across their value chain, market-based solutions like supply shed approaches and the book and claim systems are emerging as potential accelerators. But how do these tools and instruments fit into a credible net zero strategy? That is basically the answer that we will provide today. The latest SBTi draft guidance shed some light on this, offering insights into how these mechanisms can be part of a corporate emission reduction plan. However, as they gain traction, important questions arise about the credibility, the effectiveness, and also the alignment with best practices in emission accounting. So in this 30-minute session, we'll break down the key concepts behind supply shed and book and claim systems, helping you understand, first of all, how these market-based instruments work, the potential role in reducing Scope 3 emissions, and then last, how the SBTi's latest guidance treats basically these instruments. We will start with a bit of housekeeping rules. The first one, you are all muted. You will be for the whole duration of the session. You can post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll answer some of these questions during this Q&A session at the end of the call. And if we don't have time for this, we will answer your questions after by responding to you via email. Finally, the session will be recorded and sent to you all after, so people who've registered. All right, so I am Fanny de Canière, Head of Sales for France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and I am delighted to be joined by my colleagues, Eduardo Cancino, Managing Consultant leading South Pole's insetting related services globally, and Shivani Thapa, Associate Consultant specializing in agricultural value chains. In this 30-minute session, we'll tackle some of your most pressing questions, but of course, there's only so much we can cover in 30 minutes. So if you have any questions, if you'd like to dig deeper, feel free to reach out to any of us or to your direct contact at South Pole. With that, let's get started, and I'll now hand over to Shivani, who will walk us through version 2 of the Corporate Net Zero Standard.
Thank you so much, Fanny. And also thank you for the lovely introduction to the webinar. So without any further ado, let's move on to the new draft of the Corporate Net Zero Standard. As mentioned earlier by Fanny, and as many of you already know, that the SBTi is revising the corporate net zero standard. And as part of this process, SBTi has published the first draft of the version 2 of the standard for public consultation. So what the next phase includes is that first there's going to be a consultation survey, followed by a question answer webinar, and then convening of the expert working group. So in this first draft, there are a few changes, but some of the important changes I'd like to mention here is that first, there are new near-term targets. Secondly, companies can still use the version 1.2 and the near-term target criteria of 5.2. And lastly, targets will remain valid for 5 years or until 2030. So what happens after 2030 onwards is that companies must use these new targets using the version 2.0. Now, why is this draft and next step important is that tackling the scope 3 emission reduction is seen as the significant challenge in the net zero target setting. Now, the revision of this net zero standard would aim to address these challenges. For example, it would enhance accountability and provide a framework. Secondly, it also introduces a more nuanced approach to scope 3 target setting, like it focuses on relevant emission sources as well as the non-emission metrics. And lastly, it provides a greater clarity on substantiating the progress. So it includes the use of the activity pools and the indirect mitigation measures. In the next slide, we will be talking about today's topic. So we will explore where scope 3 reduction takes place, and we would delve into the two instruments set by the new draft of the corporate net zero standard. These two instruments are the supply shed project, which is a direct mitigation, and then the book and claim system, which is the indirect mitigation. Now, both of these instruments fall under the umbrella of insetting, and we will be introducing you to the concept of the insetting, followed by the explanation of these two instruments. Now, what is insetting and why does it matter? So if we go to the next slide, insetting has a lot of definitions from various standards, but here in this slide, we wanted to explain what insetting is or what we define insetting at South Pole. So insetting is an emission reduction or a carbon removal project which is directly linked to the supply chain or the production landscape. So there are two places where insetting can occur. And as today we are speaking about scope 3, we will not be speaking about the production landscape. So when a project could be a removal or a carbon reduction project occurs in the supply chain, they are often termed as on-farm intervention, supply shed projects, adjacent farmlands, or even value chain projects. And these projects in the supply chain would count towards scope 2 reductions and removals, and thereby it would count towards a near-term or a long-term science-based targets. Now in the next slide, why is insetting relevant? So as we know, and it's widely known that companies face a lot of challenges in reducing value chain emissions. So insetting plays a pivotal role in addressing these challenges. Like, for example, firstly, it helps to meet targets. So companies can address their scope 3 emissions, which is often comprising of the majority of their total greenhouse gas emissions. So when you design and implement insetting projects within your value chain, you can drive and accelerate the net zero progress. Secondly, you can also use insetting for scalability. So a well-designed insetting project aligned with the proper carbon standard can be expanded across suppliers and even regions. And lastly, insetting creates a collective impact. So it enables a co-claiming process where companies can co-claim the carbon benefits within the supply chain or on the farm level, and it encourages collaboration between the producers and the suppliers and tackles the emissions at the source. There are also other numerous benefits of insetting. For example, insetting can provide competitive advantages and also increases a brand reputation. But at the same time, insetting is not just limited to carbon, so it's not just a silo. So these insetting projects can provide additional advantages like to the farmers, it creates a job for them, it improves the community relationship, and it also provides training for the communities. Having said this, there's also other important or other relevant advantages, like it just not is limited to that area, but it also increases biodiversity along the regions where the projects are happening. So there are a lot of relevancy of insetting projects. So in the next slide, here I'm going to explain you about how companies can align their Scope 3 strategies with net zero commitments. So firstly, companies, especially category A, must set their Scope 3 targets to manage and reduce the value chain emissions. So this is essential for net zero achievement. Secondly, companies can prioritize high emission activities within the value chain, such as the tier one suppliers. And this would help drive a meaningful progress towards the net zero commitment. Thirdly, companies should set targets to ensure that 100% of the procurement would come from net zero suppliers within the net zero timeframe. And the last ones are the use of the supply shed instrument and the use of book and claim instrument, which are the two ways to align the Scope 3 strategies with net zero commitment. Now we will be diving deep into these 2 points in the following slides, and my colleague Eduardo would be expanding on it.
Thank you, Giovanni. Hi, everyone. So following what we saw in the previous slide, it's important to understand where do Scope 3 projects take place. So the most common approach would be on-farm level. Maybe you're familiar with this. So traceability up to this land management unit, also called harvested area, or if we think of another industry, could be the point where you extract your raw materials. The SBTi Net Zero guideline is introducing the supply shed instrument. Supply shed, or also known as sourcing region, which has a broader scope. If we go to the next slide, we can see the definition. A supply shed is a geographical area where a company normally sources their products, commodities, or materials. If you think of a farmer, that would be your land management unit, and the supply shed would be a group of cooperatives with farmers, or could be the first point of collection, like a processing facility. This is useful when companies face difficulties with traceability. For example, depending on where are you sitting on the value chain, you might have more access to data or less access to data. If you are in the upstream side, maybe it's more feasible, but if you are a trader or a retailer, it would be more challenging. So this also addresses this type of issues. If we go to the next slide. Also, it's important to note that the SBTi also considers now the supply shed as a Scope 3 instrument for direct mitigation, and then companies can use it for the net zero. But how does this work? Instead of having traceability up to the land management unit or a farmer or a harvested area, it's enough to have the traceability up to the supply shed, like a processing facility of a region with the cooperatives, as I mentioned. So as I mentioned, this is feasible for companies who are struggling with the traceability component. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how supply shed can support the decarbonization. If we go, yes. So you can have the activity pool level interventions, which means now the SBTi considers supply shed as part of the activity pool and then allows company to use this for Scope 3 decarbonization for the net zero. Also gives you flexibility for the reporting. So you can companies use different methods for assessing the carbon reductions in their decarbonization process. And also, as Giovanni mentioned, they provide emphasis on non-emission metrics, which means the SBTi wants you to focus not only on carbon, but also assessing sustainability from a bigger scope. So for example, you can consider tracking metrics like the revenue that comes from sustainable products. So you can also assess the financial benefits of implementing sustainability strategies in your company. If we go to the next slide, we can see the benefits and risks of this supply chain approach. Again, as also Fanny mentioned, this is still a work in progress, right? And it's emerging. But here we have some ideas that can help you moving forward when you want to implement this in your value chain. As a benefit, as you understand now, it gives you a simplified traceability. Also, it lowers monitoring costs. Normally, when you implement a supply share approach, you would need an MRV, like a monitoring, reporting, and verification system. If you're working with other actors sourcing from the same region or other stakeholders, you can share the monitoring costs because it's focused on the same area. So that's also beneficial for the implementation and the design of the project. And also you can reduce the reversal risks. Normally, when a reporting company is reporting removals and then later in another reporting year, a farmer leaves the supply chain, they are leaving with the removals, right? So you need to take into consideration. That's reporting reversals. That's what it means. You need to report for the removals that left your value chain. But if you're assessing a supply share approach, you have different farmers. So if a farmer leaves and it's compensated with another farmer with a sourcing region because you're sourcing the same volumes. So you have less risks of reporting reversals. On the other hand, you should take into consideration the leakage and permanence risks. That's why it's important to have a robust monitoring plan in place to make sure that you're accounting for the carbon and for the allocation in a good manner. Also, the double counting risk, as different actors might be making claims from the same reductions. Sometimes it's possible to do claiming when done correctly, but it's important to watch out for this one. And unverified claims. Normally, if you are implementing the supply chain for the first time, you might have the risk of underestimating or overestimating your emissions. So it's important to take this into consideration. We can go to the next slide. So we know that this is emerging, right? So how now at this stage can we ensure integrity in the supply chain systems? One is the enhanced supplier relationship. And this is very important because now we've seen in the decarbonization journey, a reporting company working alone might have decarbonization, but it's easier and faster and accelerates the decarbonization if you work with the actors from your value chain all together and also from peers from your industry and industry coalitions. So if you work together with your suppliers, you can improve data quality access, you can reduce risks, and that's also something that can ensure integrity in the system. Also, as I mentioned, having a robust MRV plan, and this MRV not only should focus on the reporting or monitoring or verification, but also taking into consideration the risk assessment, market risk, and have a framework for reporting reversals. Also, it's important to align with safeguards. There are other relevant frameworks like the land sector and removal guidance that they have been exploring already the supply chain approach, and they have already developed some safeguards. This is still a draft. They are going to release the final version by the end of the year. But if you're interested in implementing this supply chain system, it's important that you also take a look at what other regulations and frameworks related to this topic say and what safeguards they provide so you can design your project more robustly. And lastly, leverage third-party certification. As I mentioned, if it's the first time you're implementing this, it's important to have a third party who can back up your project design. Now, we can move to the book and claim section. We can go to the next slide. So what is book and claim? Book and claim is a system that allows companies to purchase certificates representing emission reductions from sustainable practice. And now it's important to note that this is achieved elsewhere, meaning that these reductions are happening not necessarily linked to your value chain. Therefore, the SBTi net zero guidelines place book and claim as an indirect mitigation system. Supply chain was a direct mitigation system. This is an indirect mitigation system. It's also important to know that this is beneficial for companies that are struggling with traceability, and also important to say that this is an interim measure. The SBTi still needs to release how would be the timeline and the criteria for book and claim later on. And also they are working towards enhancing the criteria for traceability and reporting guidelines for both book and claim and supply chain. So let's see what we have after the consultation period. We can go to the next slide, please. So how does this work? So the SBTi has provided some examples in different industries, like in the aviation and shipping, they mention buying certificates related to sustainable fuels, so then companies can incorporate these environmental benefits. So if I'm a company, I'm booking a sustainable fuel related certificate, then I can claim these reductions towards my net zero for scope 3, right? The guidelines also provided or mentioned the commodity certificate as an option for book and claim, that they haven't provided specific examples or criteria. So let's also keep an eye on what they said when they release the final version. If we go to the next slide, also as this system is evolving, there are some recommendations we have for you that you should take into consideration when you implement this type of approaches. As you can understand, these also enhance the trading and claiming for environmental benefits. It's also flexible, and you can engage with more sustainable products and sustainable suppliers in procurement that relates to the supplier engagement goal that we saw before. And also this is scalable across industries and supply chains. Also, things to take into consideration: data management workload, take into consideration in your systems and ERPs that that book and claim might bring more data management requirement. Also, the certification costs, if you're buying certificates related to sustainable fuels, include that in your budget for the project, and also is relevant to include assessments for the type of claims you're making. And lastly, double counting risks, as well as different actors might be claiming the same reduction from the same certificates or volumes, and you should take that into consideration as well. Now, if we move forward, how can we ensure integrity in the book and claim system? First of all, with the certification and verification, this is very important, because if you purchase a certificate, you need to make sure that this is properly certified and is verifiable, to make sure that the carbon accounting and carbon allocation is done correctly. Another point that the SBTi recommends is the evidence accessibility. This means that if the SBTi, a third party, or a regulator need to access the data behind the certificate, this should be available to really assess the emission reductions or carbon mitigations from this approach. And lastly, align with standards. The SBTi recommends companies, if you're going to make claims, to align with the ICL or the Sustainability Claims Good Practice guidance. If we move forward to the next slide, so we've seen now these two instruments, and we are understanding that the SBTi is developing more criteria to make sure that this is implemented correctly. So the SBTi has some recommendations as well. If you go to the next slide, yes, we can see that the SBTi encourages companies to assess the regulatory alignment where they are, meaning assess if legally, if in the country where you're applying your project, there's any legal requirement that you need, or any specific framework that you should follow, region specific. As I mentioned, there are other frameworks that you can use as a reference. Stakeholder consultation, right now, they are very interested in receiving the feedback from the industry to really take into consideration the challenges on the market, and to have this into the final version of the draft. And finally, the placeholder criteria. There are some criteria that are still under development, especially for indirect mitigation approaches like book and claim. And as I mentioned, they are focusing a lot on traceability criteria and defining the reporting guidelines for both instruments, book and claim and supply shed. And if we go to the next one, to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So lastly, I know that it's still challenging to have this new information from the guidelines, and it's still a draft, but that's also good, because that gives us time to understand it and then to see how to apply this later on when we have the final version. What we recommend as well is to have stronger safeguards for you as a reporting company. If you want to implement these tools and these approaches, it's important to use references. There are other guidelines like the land sector removal guidance, as I said, or the value chain initiative, that have already developed approaches to tackle the supply shed concepts, for example, and they have safeguards. So it's important to include that in your own design when you're also trying to tackle the decarbonization for scope 3. And also the action hierarchy. We recommend and encourage companies to focus the decarbonization and rely the decarbonization on direct actions related to emissions, reductions and removals directly linked to your supply chain. And then after, when there's no more room for improvement, you can rely on these specific instruments because they are still evolving. We can see that the SBTi is being flexible and they are taking into consideration the challenges from scope 3 and from the industry, which is good. That's why we are seeing that they are focusing on increasing the scope. So let's see what they have as a final version of these net zero guidelines for, especially for scope 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Sorry, I stop the sharing, but in any case, we are going to move on with the Q&A. So thank you very much for sending your questions through. Again, as said earlier, if we don't get to your question today, we will respond via email after the webinar. So let me have a look at the first question. I think this one will be for you, Eduardo. How can companies with complex value chains engage with their suppliers to support the transition to net zero?
Thank you. I think that's an important question, and we've seen that the SBTi is focused on supplier engagement. And right now we are in the consultation period, but after consultation, depending on what's the output, companies might be required to set targets for supplier engagement, especially for tier 1 suppliers, because you have more traction there. The goal of this target is to increase by spend the green suppliers that you have on your portfolio, and especially focus on suppliers from tier 1 that are in the process of incorporating the net zero approach, or they have already done it. What we can see from the SBTi is that they are enforcing companies to really work towards supplier engagement, so later on their targets can be aligned to your targets and you can share the decarbonization efforts.
Thank you very much. The next question, where would we see different insetting definitions and why? Shivani, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, thanks, Fanny. So the concept of insetting began when the GHG Scope 3 standard was released about the year 2011. And then the International Platform for Insetting and even South Pole coined the term insetting. So over the following years, there have been different standards and bodies to standardize the carbon claim market from offsetting to insetting. And then there have been other standards and key players in the market with their own definitions, such as the Value Chain Intervention Guidance from the VCI, which is the Value Chain Initiative, and even the Draft Land Sector and Removals Guidance. And nowadays, insetting can be, or insetting is being used by a lot of companies internally as part of their climate strategies. So that's why there is no common international standard or consistent definition of insetting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have some time for next question. How does book and claim in this SBTi draft differ from beyond value chain mitigation or carbon offsets, which are not allowed by the GHG protocol? Good transition for the next webinar, by the way, but Eduardo, please take this one.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are two things that we need to assess, like the rules for reporting your GHG inventory follow the GHG protocol, right? And you cannot use offsetting there. That stays the same. But now the SBTi is allowing companies to include these scope 3 instruments, right, for decarbonization for the net zero targets. So what they are saying is that you can incorporate indirect mitigation instruments like the book and claim as an alternative to complement the direct mitigation instruments like supply shed for the decarbonization in the SBTi approach. It's also important to note that the main difference is that these direct or indirect mitigation instruments are designed for specific value chains. So you can apply these concepts into your value chains. Whereas the beyond value chain mitigation are designed for global mitigation efforts or global goals. So it's not related to a specific value chain. That's why it's not considered part of this net zero standard.
Thank you very much. Well, conscious of time, we'll close the Q&A now, but thank you very much for joining us today. We really hope this session provided valuable insights into Scope 3 decarbonisation and how emerging market-based instruments fit into corporate net zero strategies. If you haven't already, please be sure to register for our next webinar, BVCM and neutralization, why early action matters, coming up in early May on the 7th of May, and then the last session at the end of May. In this session, we'll explore why companies cannot wait until their net zero targets year to address residual emissions, the importance of early investment in high quality carbon removal projects, and how to build a credible carbon portfolio, a carbon credit portfolio aligned with the evolving evolutions and expectations. Um, we'll also discuss how businesses can gain early recognition for their climate contributions while preparing for future residual emission requirements. So really don't miss out this opportunity to stay ahead of these critical updates and register now. We will be very happy to see you there. With that, thank you again and have a very lovely day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.